Welcome back to Hopeful Horizon, where we bring you stories that warm the heart and challenge the mind. Today's story dives deep into the pressures of privilege, prejudice, and identity. What happens when a student, scorned and ridiculed by his elite peers, quietly endures their mockery until the day they learn who his father is? It's a powerful reminder that you should never judge someone by their appearance or background because you never know their true worth. Stay with us as we unfold a story about class, resilience, and a shocking twist. If you love tales filled with unexpected twists and life-changing moments, be sure to comment below. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss another inspiring story from Hopeful Horizon. Let us know where you're listening from in the comments. The gates of Riverton Academy loomed high above, their intricate ironwork twisting like ivy across the archways. An elite institution with a century-old reputation for molding the future leaders of society, Riverton was the epitome of privilege. This was the place where the children of CEOs, politicians, and even royalty came to study. Marcus Bell stood at the entrance, clutching his worn-out backpack. His dark eyes traced the outlines of the massive buildings, his nerves bubbling beneath his calm exterior. Unlike most students here, Marcus wasn't born into wealth or privilege. He had worked his way in through a full academic scholarship, but he already felt the weight of not belonging. As he walked through the courtyard, students passed by in groups, their pristine uniforms contrasting sharply with his slightly faded blazer. Whispers and stares followed him like a shadow. He knew what they were thinking. What was a boy like him doing here? "Is that the new kid?" a voice murmured nearby. "How'd he even get in?" Marcus clenched his jaw but kept walking, his head held high. He had learned early on that the best way to handle situations like this was to stay quiet, let it roll off his back. But inside, he couldn't help but feel the sting. Once inside, he was directed to his classroom. The marble floors echoed with the sound of polished shoes, the walls lined with historical portraits of alumni who had gone on to great things. Marcus noticed a few familiar last names: political dynasties, tech billionaires, hedge fund managers. He couldn't escape the feeling that he was an outsider here. Taking a seat near the back, Marcus was met with more curious looks. Some were dismissive, others were outright disdainful. Across the room, a group of boys smirked at him, their posture relaxed, in the knowledge that this was their territory. One of them, a tall boy with perfectly combed hair and an air of arrogance, leaned over to his friend and said loud enough for Marcus to hear, "He's just the scholarship kid. Probably doesn't even know which fork to use at dinner." Laughter rippled through the group. Marcus's cheeks burned, but he didn't respond. Instead, he opened his notebook, scribbling down the lesson as the teacher began. But the taunts didn't stop. Throughout the day, whispers followed him down the halls. Snide comments greeted him in the lunchroom, and by the time the final bell rang, Marcus felt emotionally drained. That night, as he lay in his small dorm room, Marcus thought about his father's words before he left for Riverton. "You've earned your place there," his father had said with a proud smile. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Remember, son, it's not where you start, it's where you finish." Marcus held on to those words like a lifeline, determined not to let the ridicule break him. But he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something they didn't know about him, something they'd never expect. Marcus sat alone in the lunchroom, his tray untouched in front of him. The chatter of students filled the grand dining hall, but he wasn't a part of their world. Despite the modern design of the cafeteria, with its high ceilings, gleaming tables, and natural light streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows, Marcus felt as if he were sitting in the shadow of a towering wall that separated him from everyone else. He glanced around, hoping for just one familiar face, someone to talk to. But it was clear that he was an outsider. Across the room, the same group of boys who had taunted him in class were watching him again. Their leader, the tall boy from earlier, James McAllister, the son of a prominent senator, nudged one of his friends. "I can't believe they're letting anyone in these days," James said with a sneer. "You'd think this was some charity case school now." His friends snickered, casting sideways glances at Marcus. Marcus stiffened, pretending not to hear. His heart pounded in his chest, and the knot in his stomach tightened. He tried to focus on his food, but the clattering of trays, the buzzing conversations, and the occasional bursts of laughter made it impossible to ignore the hostility directed at him. Suddenly, a voice rang out, loud enough for the whole cafeteria to hear. "Hey, Belle, what's it like to be poor in a place like this?" The words echoed through the room, and for a moment, everything seemed to pause. Marcus felt the heat rising in his face as all eyes turned toward him. He didn't need to look to know who had spoken. James was standing now, his smirk spreading across his face as he basked in the attention. Marcus gritted his teeth, willing himself to stay calm, but it was getting harder to ignore the comments, the constant whispers that followed him everywhere he went. "Come on, man, don't ignore us," James said, walking over to Marcus's table. "We're all dying to know. How'd a kid like you even get in here? Must have taken a lot of begging, huh?" The other students around the cafeteria began to murmur, some looking uncomfortable, others watching with amused curiosity. Marcus kept his eyes on his plate, refusing to engage. He knew if he said something back, it would only escalate things. "Maybe he sold something to get in," one of James's friends added with a laugh. "You know, street business." James grinned, leaning in closer to Marcus. "Or maybe his daddy's just a nobody. Isn't that right? That's why you're keeping quiet, huh?" The moment stretched, tension thick in the air. Marcus wanted to shout back, to tell them they were wrong, that they had no idea who he was or what his family had been through. But he held back, swallowing the anger. His father had always told him to rise above. "Don't let them get to you, Marcus. You're stronger than their words," his father had said. But it was becoming harder and harder to follow that advice. Just as Marcus felt he couldn't take it anymore, a voice interrupted. "That's enough, McAllister." Everyone turned to see Claire, one of the few students who hadn't joined in the taunting, standing up from her table. She was tall, with dark brown hair, tied back in a neat ponytail, and a sharpness in her gaze that demanded attention. Claire came from old money herself, her parents being influential business people, but she was known for her fairness. James rolled his eyes, but his smile faltered slightly. "What's the matter, Claire? Just having a little fun?" "Fun?" Claire crossed her arms, unimpressed. "It's pretty sad if you think bullying someone makes you look good." A few heads nodded in agreement, and James's smirk faded further. He gave Marcus one last sneer before walking back to his table, muttering under his breath, "Whatever." "Not worth my time." Marcus exhaled, grateful that Claire had intervened, but the damage was done. He had hoped to keep his head down, to get through his time at Riverton quietly, but it was clear that wouldn't be possible. After lunch, as he walked to his next class, Claire caught up with him. "Hey," she said, falling into step beside him. "Don't let them get to you. They're just a bunch of jerks." Marcus offered her a small, appreciative smile. "Thanks for stepping in back there." "No problem," Claire replied, her tone light. "James thinks he's untouchable because of who his dad is, but he's not as important as he thinks." Marcus nodded, but didn't say anything. He appreciated Claire's kindness, but deep down, he knew that things would only get worse if he let it show how much the bullying affected him. He needed to stay focused on his work, keep his head down, and get through his time at Riverton. But as he walked down the pristine halls of the school, past the portraits of former students who had become world leaders, he couldn't help but feel a simmering frustration beneath the surface. These people, all of them, thought they knew him. They thought they had him figured out. Little did they know, Marcus wasn't as alone or powerless as they believed. And soon enough, they'd learn exactly who he was and where he came from. The next few days passed in a blur for Marcus, a mixture of tension and quiet determination. He kept to himself, attending classes and avoiding confrontation, but the whispers still followed him. Riverton Academy felt like an enormous chessboard where everyone knew their role except him. Despite his best efforts to blend in, Marcus always felt like an outsider, constantly aware of the glares from his classmates. The school was pristine, polished marble floors, towering columns, and walls adorned with historical portraits of former students who had gone on to achieve greatness. Marcus couldn't help but feel the weight of the legacy that clung to every corner of the campus. It was a constant reminder that Riverton wasn't just a school, it was an institution, and everyone here knew exactly who belonged and who didn't. One afternoon, Marcus was in the library, buried in his textbooks, trying to focus on his upcoming exams. The silence was a relief from the daily taunts, and the smell of old books provided a strange comfort. He had always loved learning, and for a brief moment, he was able to lose himself in the material, but his peace was short-lived. As he turned the page, he heard the now familiar snicker of James McAllister approaching from behind. His heart sank. "Well, well, look who's hiding in the library," James said, leaning over the table with that same smug grin. "Studying hard, huh? Trying to keep up with the rest of us?" Marcus clenched his jaw, keeping his eyes on his book. He wouldn't give James the satisfaction of a reaction. "You know," James continued, sitting across from him, "you could save yourself a lot of trouble if you just admitted you don't belong here. Riverton isn't for people like you." Marcus felt his hands tighten into fists under the table. He was doing everything he could to keep his composure, but the anger was bubbling up, threatening to spill over. Before Marcus could respond, another voice joined the conversation. "I'd watch your mouth if I were you, McAllister." Marcus looked up, startled, as the librarian, Mr. Daniels, stood nearby, his eyes fixed on James with disapproval. Mr. Daniels was an older man, with silver hair and a no-nonsense demeanor, and he wasn't the type to tolerate bullying in his library. James's confident smirk faded for a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. "Just having a friendly chat, Mr. Daniels." "Find somewhere else to have it," Mr. Daniels said firmly. "This is a library, not your personal playground." James scoffed, rising to his feet. "Whatever." He cast one last glance at Marcus before sauntering out of the room, muttering under his breath. Marcus let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He glanced up at Mr. Daniels, who gave him a brief nod before returning to his desk. The tension slowly began to dissipate, but the encounter left a bitter taste in Marcus's mouth. Later that evening, Marcus returned to his dorm room, still replaying the confrontation in his mind. His room was small but comfortable, a stark contrast to the opulence of the rest of the school. He was just about to settle into bed when his phone buzzed. It was a message from his mother. "Call me when you can. Your father's in town and wants to see you." Marcus stared at the message for a long moment, his chest tightening. His father? Here? Why now? He dialed his mother's number, and after a few rings, she picked up. "Hey, Mom," Marcus said, his voice hesitant. "You said Dad's in town?" "Yes," his mother replied, her tone gentle but firm. "He's attending a business meeting not far from your school and thought it would be a good time to check in on you." Marcus's stomach turned. His relationship with his father had always been complicated. His father was a powerful man, a figure of immense influence in the corporate world, and though he had always provided for the family, he had never been an active presence in Marcus's life. To most people, Marcus's father was a mystery, an enigma. Even to Marcus, there was so much about him that remained hidden. "Does he know what's been going on at school?" Marcus asked quietly. His mother paused. "He knows some of it, but I didn't want to worry him too much. You know how he is." Marcus nodded, though his mother couldn't see him. His father wasn't the type to rush to his aid. In fact, Marcus doubted his father even cared about the day-to-day struggles he faced at Riverton. "When does he want to meet?" Marcus asked, his voice resigned. "Tomorrow, after your classes," his mother replied. "I'll send you the details." The next day, Marcus couldn't concentrate. The thought of seeing his father again after so long weighed heavily on him. And though he tried to focus on his schoolwork, his mind kept wandering back to the looming meeting. By the time the final bell rang, Marcus felt a mix of anxiety and exhaustion. He made his way to the address his mother had sent him, his mind racing with questions. When he arrived, he found himself standing in front of a luxurious restaurant downtown. As he walked inside, the hostess greeted him and led him to a private dining room. Sitting at the head of the table, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, was his father, Jonathan Bell. "Marcus," Jonathan said, rising to his feet with a smile, "it's good to see you." Marcus swallowed hard, the sight of his father stirring a mix of emotions. It had been over a year since they last spoke in person. "Dad," Jonathan motioned for him to sit. "I've heard you've been having a rough time at school. Want to talk about it?" Marcus hesitated. This wasn't the warm, comforting reunion he had hoped for. His father's tone was professional, as if they were discussing a business deal rather than the bullying and isolation Marcus had been enduring. I'm managing, Marcus said carefully, sitting down. It's nothing I can't handle. Jonathan raised an eyebrow, studying him. Is that so? Because your mother seems to think otherwise. Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He had never been able to fool his father, and now was no different. What's going on, Marcus? Who's giving you trouble? Marcus took a deep breath, knowing that things were about to change. Marcus sat in the restaurant, the tension between him and his father almost palpable. Jonathan Bell's gaze was piercing, like he was analyzing every word Marcus said, every twitch of his face. Marcus had never been able to hide anything from his father, even though he had tried to for years. This time was no different. They're just different, Marcus began, choosing his words carefully. They come from families with legacies, money, and connections. I'm just trying to fit in. Jonathan's eyes narrowed slightly. And these kids, they're giving you trouble because of that? Marcus hesitated. It wasn't just about fitting in. It was about survival in a place that constantly reminded him he wasn't one of them. He had dealt with the taunts, the rumors, the whispered insults, and the deliberate exclusion. But how could he explain that without sounding weak in front of his father? They don't think I belong there, Marcus admitted, looking down at his hands. They don't think I should even be at Riverton. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. He was quiet for a moment, but Marcus knew better than to mistake his silence for indifference. His father was thinking, calculating his next move. Do you think they're right? Jonathan asked, his voice calm but firm. Marcus looked up, startled. What? Do you think they're right? Jonathan repeated. That you don't belong there? Marcus blinked, caught off guard by the question. Did he think that? He had worked hard to earn his place at Riverton, but no matter how hard he tried, he always felt out of place, like he was swimming against the current, fighting to stay afloat in a sea of privilege. I don't know, Marcus said honestly, his voice quieter now. Sometimes I feel like I don't. Jonathan sighed, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. Marcus, you don't need to fit in with them. You're not like them, and that's not a bad thing. Marcus furrowed his brow, confused by his father's words. But if I don't fit in, how am I supposed to survive at Riverton? Jonathan smirked slightly, the corners of his lips lifting in a knowing smile. Who said anything about surviving? You're not there to survive, Marcus. You're there to excel, to make your mark. And trust me, those kids, they're going to regret ever doubting you. Marcus felt a small spark of hope light up in his chest. It wasn't that his father was brushing off his struggles, but there was something in his tone, in the way he spoke, that gave Marcus the sense that his father knew something he didn't. Before Marcus could ask what Jonathan meant, his father leaned forward, his expression serious again. I want you to listen carefully, Marcus. Tomorrow, I'm going to make sure you're treated with the respect you deserve at that school, not because of who I am, but because of who you are. Marcus's eyes widened in confusion. What do you mean? Jonathan smiled, a small, mysterious smile that sent a chill down Marcus's spine. You'll see. The conversation shifted after that, and they talked about less serious matters, but Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something big was about to happen. His father had always been a man of power and influence, but Marcus had no idea just how much weight his name carried. The next morning, Marcus arrived at Riverton with a strange sense of anticipation. He couldn't explain it, but he felt like the air around him had changed, like something monumental was about to unfold. His classmates still whispered behind his back, still shot him disdainful glances, but Marcus didn't care. His father's words had planted a seed of confidence in him, one that he hadn't felt in a long time. He walked into the school, his backpack slung over one shoulder, and headed to his first class. As he passed by the main office, he noticed something odd. A group of administrators stood huddled together, their faces pale, talking in hushed voices. Marcus couldn't make out what they were saying, but the urgency in their body language was hard to miss. As the day progressed, the tension in the air only grew. Teachers seemed on edge, students whispered more than usual, and even James McAllister kept his distance, his usual smug grin absent. It wasn't until lunch that Marcus found out why. He was sitting alone at his usual table, eating quietly, when one of his classmates rushed up to him, her eyes wide with excitement. "Marcus," she gasped, Did you hear? Marcus raised an eyebrow, confused. Hear what? The headmaster's been replaced. They said it happened this morning out of nowhere. And get this, your dad's on the school board. Everyone's talking about it. Marcus felt his heart skip a beat. His father? On the board? He hadn't known that. But as the pieces began to click together in his mind, it all started to make sense. The way his father had spoken the night before, the cryptic smile. It was all connected. Jonathan Bell had pulled strings, and not just any strings. He had changed the very structure of the school, removing the headmaster who had allowed the toxic environment to thrive. Marcus couldn't believe it. His father had taken action in a way that only someone with true power could. By the time the final bell rang, the entire school was buzzing with rumors. Everyone knew now that Marcus wasn't just another student at Riverton. He was Jonathan Bell's son, and that carried weight. As Marcus walked through the hallways, he noticed a shift. People who had once ignored him or looked down on him now gave him respectful nods or avoided his gaze altogether. Even James McAllister, who had made it his mission to torment Marcus, seemed to shrink into the background, unwilling to confront him. For the first time since he'd arrived at Riverton, Marcus felt like he wasn't just surviving, he was winning. Marcus walked down the halls of Riverton Academy, feeling the shift in the air. It wasn't just the students who noticed him differently now, it was the entire atmosphere. Whispers followed him, not out of disdain this time, but out of curiosity, and more importantly, respect. People moved aside when he walked past, giving him space in a way they never had before. It was surreal. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw a message from his father. Jonathan Bell. Let me know how your day goes. Marcus smiled slightly. His father's plan had worked. In a single swift move, Jonathan had managed to flip the power dynamic at Riverton. The headmaster was gone, and with him, the entire foundation of the school's elite clique had been shaken. It was clear now, Marcus wasn't just another student here, he was the son of Jonathan Bell, and everyone knew what that meant. As he walked into his next class, heads turned. Even the teacher, Mr. Gallagher, who had been distant and dismissive before, greeted him with a nervous smile. "Ah, Marcus, good to see you," he said, a little too eagerly. Marcus sat down, trying to suppress the growing sense of satisfaction. This was different. This wasn't just about being noticed. This was about power. For the first time, he felt like he had control over the situation. Throughout the lesson, Marcus barely heard a word of what Mr. Gallagher said. His mind was elsewhere, thinking about how quickly everything had changed. His father's influence had done more than just level the playing field. It had tilted it in Marcus's favor. But even as that thought filled him with pride, a question lingered in the back of his mind. What would happen next? By lunchtime, Marcus had grown accustomed to the new attention. People who had once ignored him were now suddenly eager to make conversation. As he entered the dining hall, he noticed a group of students sitting at one of the larger tables, the same group that had always sneered at him and treated him as an outsider. James McAllister, the ringleader of Marcus's tormentors, sat at the head of the table. But today, something was different. He wasn't wearing his usual cocky grin. Instead, he sat hunched over his food, barely speaking to the others. His eyes darted around the room, as if he were avoiding someone's gaze. Marcus walked past the table, locking eyes with James for just a moment. The look in James's eyes was unmistakable. Fear. It was a strange feeling, seeing the person who had caused him so much pain, now cowering under his gaze. But instead of reveling in it, Marcus felt a wave of something else. Pity, perhaps. Or maybe it was just the realization that the power James had once wielded over him was gone, dissolved in the wake of his father's actions. He moved to sit at a table near the back, his usual spot, but before he could take a seat, someone called out his name. "Marcus, come sit with us." He turned to see a group of students, ones who had always been part of Riverton's elite, but had never outright bullied him, gesturing for him to join them. He hesitated for a moment, unsure if this was just a part of the new dynamics or if they genuinely wanted him there. Either way, the invitation was real. Marcus walked over, pulling out a chair at their table. As soon as he sat down, the conversation resumed, but this time they included him. For the first time, Marcus felt like he wasn't just a spectator in the social hierarchy of Riverton, he was part of it. As they talked, he realized something important. These students weren't suddenly being friendly because they liked him. They were doing it because they respected him, or more accurately, they respected what his father represented. It was a shallow kind of power, but power nonetheless. But even as the conversation flowed around him, Marcus couldn't shake the nagging feeling that this wasn't what he wanted. Yes, he had their attention now, but was this really what mattered? After school, Marcus found himself sitting in his father's office once again, the sleek city skyline stretching out behind Jonathan Bell as he worked at his desk. "How was your day?" Jonathan asked, without looking up from his paperwork. Marcus hesitated. "Different." Jonathan raised an eyebrow, finally glancing up. "Different how?" "People respect me now," Marcus said, trying to find the right words. "But it's not real. They respect you, or at least your name." Jonathan leaned back in his chair, studying his son. "That's how it works, Marcus. Influence, power. People follow strength, whether they like you or not." "I get that," Marcus said, frowning, "but I don't want people to respect me just because of you." Jonathan's expression softened slightly. "You're not wrong, but sometimes power opens doors that would otherwise be closed. What you do after those doors open is up to you." Marcus thought about that for a moment. His father was right, in a way. The power shift had given him an opportunity, but what came next was in his hands. Jonathan stood up and walked over to the window, looking out at the city below. "You have something most of those kids will never have, Marcus. You have the chance to build something, to be someone. Don't let anyone make you feel like you don't belong." Marcus nodded, but he knew there was more to it than that. Belonging wasn't just about power or influence. It was about being valued for who you were, not just what you represented. And in that moment, Marcus realized that his journey at Riverton wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. The next morning, Marcus stood outside the gates of Riverton Academy, looking up at the grand building before him. Everything felt different now, not because the walls had changed or the students were different, but because Marcus himself had shifted. For the first time since he set foot in Riverton, he felt a sense of belonging, not because of his father's name, but because of the opportunity ahead. As he walked through the halls, the familiar buzz of whispers followed him. But this time, Marcus didn't feel the weight of the stairs. He had learned something important. His power, his value, wasn't defined by his father's influence. It was something he would have to forge for himself. In his first class of the day, history, the teacher, Ms. Hall, greeted him with the same uncomfortable smile as before. But this time, Marcus noticed something different about her. Instead of the cold detachment she used to exude, there was an air of caution in how she addressed him, as if she, too, wasn't sure how to navigate this new dynamic. "Good morning, Marcus," she said, her voice overly polite. "Morning, Ms. Hall," Marcus replied, taking his seat. The lesson droned on, but Marcus's mind was elsewhere. He kept thinking about the conversation he'd had with his father the night before, about power and influence. He'd seen firsthand how quickly things could change, but he also knew that change had to come from within. He didn't want to rely on his father's shadow forever. As the bell rang, Marcus gathered his things and headed toward his locker. Just as he reached it, he heard footsteps behind him. He turned to see James McAllister standing there, his face a mask of uncertainty. James, who had been the ringleader of Marcus's tormentors, now looked like a shadow of his former self. His cocky demeanor was gone, replaced by a nervous energy. "Marcus," James began, his voice faltering slightly, "can I talk to you for a second?" Marcus stared at him for a moment, wondering what James could possibly want now. The last time they had spoken, James had humiliated him in front of the entire class. But that was before Marcus's father had shaken up the school's power structure. "What do you want, James?" Marcus asked, his tone calm but firm. James shifted uncomfortably, glancing around the hallway to make sure no one was listening. "Look, man, I just wanted to say I'm sorry for everything." Marcus raised an eyebrow. This was not what he expected. James had never shown any remorse before, and now, out of nowhere, he was apologizing. Something didn't add up. "Sorry? For what?" Marcus pressed, his voice edged with skepticism. James swallowed hard. For how I treated you. I was a jerk, and I shouldn't have been. It wasn't right. Marcus crossed his arms, leaning against his locker. He wasn't going to let James off the hook that easily. Why now? Why are you suddenly sorry? James sighed, running a hand through his hair. Because I see things differently now. Your dad, everything's changed, and I get that I was wrong. There it was, the real reason. James wasn't apologizing out of genuine remorse. He was apologizing because the power dynamics had shifted, and he didn't want to be on the wrong side of it. I see, Marcus said, his voice cool. So, you're sorry because you're afraid of what my dad might do, not because you actually regret how you treated me. James opened his mouth to protest, but no words came out. He knew Marcus had seen right through him. Look, Marcus continued, I'm not interested in your apology. If you're really sorry, prove it by changing how you treat people. Not just me, everyone. James nodded, his face reddening with embarrassment. You're right. I'll do better. Without another word, Marcus turned and walked away, leaving James standing there, his apology hanging in the air. As the day went on, Marcus found himself reflecting on the encounter with James. It was strange how quickly people's attitudes could change when power shifted. But Marcus wasn't going to let it get to his head. His father had opened doors for him, yes, but it was up to him to decide how to walk through them. At lunch, Marcus sat with the same group of students who had invited him the day before. The conversation was light, but Marcus could sense the undercurrent of curiosity beneath it all. They were still trying to figure him out, still unsure of where he fit into their world. But Marcus wasn't interested in fitting into their world. He wanted to build something of his own. Later that afternoon, Marcus found himself standing outside the headmaster's office. The new headmaster, Dr. Harlan, had requested a meeting with him. Marcus wasn't sure what to expect, but he knew it would have something to do with the changes his father had set in motion. Come in, Doctor, Harlan's voice called from inside. Marcus opened the door and stepped into the office. Dr. Harlan was sitting behind a large wooden desk, papers neatly stacked in front of him. He was a tall man with sharp features and a calm demeanor, very different from the previous headmaster. Marcus, Dr. Harlan said with a warm smile, please have a seat. Marcus sat down, feeling the weight of the moment. He had never been called to the headmaster's office before, and it felt strange to be sitting here now, especially under these circumstances. I wanted to talk to you about your experience here at Riverton, Dr. Harlan began, folding his hands in front of him. I understand that things haven't been easy for you. Marcus nodded, unsure of where this was going. I want you to know that the school is committed to making sure that all students feel valued and respected, Dr. Harlan continued. Your father's involvement has brought certain issues to light, and we're taking steps to address them. Marcus remained silent, listening carefully. I also understand that you're in a unique position now, Dr. Harlan said, his tone thoughtful. You have the opportunity to be a leader among your peers, to set an example for how we can create a more inclusive and supportive environment. Marcus frowned slightly. You mean because of my dad? Dr. Harlan shook his head. No, because of you. You've shown resilience in the face of adversity, and that's something we need more of here at Riverton. I believe you have the potential to be a positive force for change. The words hit Marcus in a way he hadn't expected. For so long, he had felt like an outsider, someone who didn't belong. But now, sitting here in the headmaster's office, he realized that maybe, just maybe, he had a chance to make a difference, not just for himself, but for others like him. Thank you, Dr. Harlan, Marcus said, his voice steady. I'll do my best. As he left the office, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose. The path forward wasn't going to be easy, but for the first time, he felt like he had the power to shape it. And so, Marcus's journey at Riverton Academy took on a new direction, one not defined by the legacy of his father, but by his own strength and determination. In a world where power and influence often dictate who belongs, Marcus chose to rise above, using his experience to create a more inclusive and understanding environment for those who came after him. Thank you for joining us on this journey through Marcus's story. If it moved you or sparked reflection, let us know where you're listening from. Leave a comment below, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell for more stories like this one.